Hello there, it's Jennifer. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm really excited because today I'm getting inky. It's been a while since I've done a video that's all about experimenting with inks and getting new looks, fun new techniques, and today I did just that, and it made me so happy. In fact, I have two videos that came out of this little crafty session, and both have new techniques, at least new to me, that I found from experimenting. Today's video is about this new inky technique with stencils, and tomorrow I'll show a different variation using embossing folders. And the best part is, if you're a crafter, I'm guessing you have supplies on hand that you can use to try this on your own. So today again is all about inks and stencils and a surprise supply that I bet you have that gives your inks a new look. So let's get started with the first two cards. It's actually a pair of cards. This is a 2-for-1 technique with this particular example. I will be using a new stencil from Simon Says Stamp called Falling in Love. I love these playful hearts, but you really could use any stencil that you may have. Now I have a piece of white cardstock. This is heavyweight Neenah Classic Crest Solar White and 110 pound, but you should be able to use any heavyweight cardstock. Now I'm applying Simon Says Stamp saturated ink, this is the amethyst color, onto that cardstock with an Altenew large blending brush. After I did some amethyst, I'm also using violet, making sure to overlap with the ink I've already put down. The nice thing about this technique is you don't have to take the time to get a great blend. Then I moved on to the cadet color. Now, the reason this is taking me longer to put this ink down is these ink pads need to be re-inked very badly. And to be honest with you, I couldn't find my reinkers. I had ordered a bunch of them, couldn't find them. I found them after the video. So I apologize that it took me a little effort, but you can see that I was able to get a decent blend down. And the last color I used is Ocean. Now I use Simon Says Stamp Pawsitively saturated inks today because the colors are divine. However, you could do this with other inks. You're just going to need to test your inks out. My guess is this technique will work with any inks that react with water. To find out if your inks work, you'll just have to test it as we go. All right, so now I have the stencil, I have my trimmed down background, and I'm going to put tape at the top to create a hinge. This will be really helpful with the technique. I'm using Easy C tape here. You could use washi tape, painter's tape, whatever you have on hand. But I do recommend a few pieces because you really want this to stay connected throughout the technique. Next up, you'll need your die cut machine to be set up to make an impression with the die. So if you look at your die cut machine instructions, it'll show you how to emboss or make an impression with the die. It always involves a flexible mat like this gray one that you see here. So I'm following the sandwich on my Spellbinders die cut machine. Almost all die cut machines come with a flexible mat. Now that I have my die cut machine set up and ready to go, I have my cardstock here that I'm opening up. So I opened along that hinge and I'm covering up the inked cardstock piece. That's key. You want to cover up your inked piece. Now I'm going to slow this down here. Onto the stencil side, you're going to spritz with rubbing alcohol. So I have a Spellbinders Mighty Mister spray bottle. I love this bottle. It does an extended mist, and I did a few sprays on there. The nice thing about rubbing alcohol is it sprays on smoothly. It doesn't kind of bubble up and pool up like water, so you can get pretty even coverage. Once I have that coverage, I will close up my little hinged sandwich here and place it onto that flexible embossing mat. I put a piece of paper in there, but that's really not necessary. I'll then run that through my die cut machine, and this will apply a lot of pressure. And what happens is that rubbing alcohol gets pressed into the inked cardstock and it reacts. And you'll see how it softens there. So it's beautiful already, but we're going to step it up so it's more obvious. Now, because I've taped the stencil and cardstock together, I can repeat this process a few times and it'll always end up in the same position. So I'll cover up the inked area. I'm just using some packaging. I'll spray rubbing alcohol onto that stencil. Try to get even coverage, but it really doesn't matter because you can repeat the process. I'll place that onto my flexible mat. Again, that extra piece of cardstock was in there because I thought I needed it to catch the extra rubbing alcohol. But the nice thing about rubbing alcohol is it dries pretty quickly, it evaporates pretty quickly, so you don't get as much of a mess as you would with water. I'm doing this technique 3 times because that I feel gives the best results. Now, I'm using isopropyl alcohol. It's, I think, 90%. I just got mine at the local grocery store. I'll put a link below, but any of those types of rubbing alcohols, no matter what percent, should work well for this. If you don't have rubbing alcohol, you could also use water, but I find rubbing alcohol gives more of a crisp result, whereas using water for this technique can give more of a watercolory result that isn't as perfect, I guess. And I just think this is beautiful. Now, a few tips. First of all, I just let this air dry instead of heat setting it. Also, when you're spraying rubbing alcohol, you want to be careful. You don't want to inhale a lot of that. So what I do is I either take it outside and I do that, or I put a fan so it blows all that excess rubbing alcohol away from me so I'm not really breathing it in. If you have concerns, you could always just mist with water and get a somewhat similar look. Now, if you are unsure what inks work for this, try the inks you have. Just take some rubbing alcohol, kind of press it on to some cardstock that's inked up and see if it reacts. I thought I'd add a little more to this background. Isn't it beautiful? I love how this technique works. I'm placing it into my Misty stamping tool with my Brutus Monroe stick and stamp mat. It'll hold it in place as I stamp with this background stamp. This is an oldie but goodie favorite of mine, the Simon Says stamp, You Are stamp. I love text background stamps. Now I'm taking the stencil and I'm lining it up with that inking that we've already done. And I'm using a few pieces of tape over on the right-hand side. Notice my tape isn't landing onto the sticky portion of the stick and stamp mat. You don't want to put tape on that sticky portion and really want to stick. Instead, it's on the outside edge. You could use a magnet instead. Now, towards the top of the stamp, I'm stamping with the same color of ink that I did my inking with. So that was amethyst. I'll also bring in the violet. And I'm stamping a few times here because I'm stamping with the same color ink. I want this to be darker so it shows up. So by stamping multiple times, it'll show up even more. Now, you'll notice I'm putting a lot of pressure into this. This is my workout for the day, but the reason I'm doing that is I'm stamping over a stencil. And the more pressure I put, the more it fills the opening of the stencil. Now, it won't fill all the way to the edge of the stencil because of that little bump that there is, a little raised dimension of the stencil, but you'll still get beautiful results. If you wanted to, you could take that stencil and all that inking that we already have on it, you could just do a little mist of water and then kind of press it onto cardstock and use up that ink. I didn't do that today. I just was trying to save time. However, I'm just going to clean off my stencil with rubbing alcohol. Now, here's a really important part. I do not use rubbing alcohol on my stamps. Never use it on your stamps. It's okay to use on stencils. It's okay to use on your glasswork surface, but never use it on your stamps. All right, so now I really like this background and I really wanted to get 2 cards out of it. So this piece is about 6 by 6, so I'm going to cut it roughly in half so that I have 2 panels to put on 2 cards. That's one of the fun things about stencils and background stamps is they usually are 6 by 6, so you can get 2 cards from them. Now let's start with this first card. On this one, I'll just show you the products I used. It was very easy to do. I used the Simon Says Stamp Falling Hearts Embossing Folder. This is an older one that I find myself reaching for a lot. And I used that on a piece of white cardstock that'll be 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and it'll be glued to my note card. Now for a sentiment, I'm using an older die set from Simon Says Stamp and CZ Design. This is Just a Note. I reach for this one often because it's a sentiment that can be used for a lot of different occasions. For the inside of my card, I used a small sentiment from this new Hugs to You stamp set. It says, "'Cause I love you so much." I just thought that was sweet. But this set is one that I'm looking forward to using because the Hugs to You, there is a coordinating die and a coordinating stencil so you can easily color it in. Then there's the option for the hugs on the bottom that has the little flowers. I just feel this has a fun, playful look that can be used in many ways because you could use the stencil alone, the stencil with the dies, or the stamps with the dies, and the stamps and the stencils with the dies. So I'm hoping to use this one in the future very soon. So here is the final card. I assembled it off screen because it's very easy to do. I have a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card. On the front, I added a panel that I used that 3D Falling Hearts embossing folder. I added one of my inked panels, and then I did the Just a Note with white cardstock and silver glitter cardstock. And I also added some silver glitter hearts that I created with some dies that I've had for a very long time. I really like using small hearts as accents on my cards, usually 3 of them or 5 of them, and I always put 2 close together. Now, I did create that second card also using the new Simon Says Stamp Love You More sentiment die set. So it's got the Love You More and this shadow for it. Now this time I allowed the Love You More die cut to hang off the side of the card. I love that look. So I will put this 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card into a bigger envelope. I placed it into an A6 envelope so it has room for that sentiment hanging off the side. I really like the look of the Love You More, and in tomorrow's video, I will show you how to change it up to get a different sentiment. And here you can see those textured hearts in the background on the white cardstock, and then the stamping and the fun inking technique we did on this stenciled background. One of my favorite things to do right now is to mix different patterns and different textures, like these hearts and the glitter paper. I just think it adds to the card and it gives a lot of interest without a lot of effort. All right, let's move on to the next example. This one's really easy to do, and it just demonstrates another way to do this technique. All right, so I have a piece of heavyweight white cardstock. Just try whatever cardstock you have. And I'm applying the Simon Says Stamp saturated ink in the amethyst color in the center of the white cardstock panel. This is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Then around that, I'm putting a rose ink color, and then around that, I'll put a salmon color. Now I'm overlapping these to allow for a better blending, but with this technique, it's very forgiving because when you do the rubbing alcohol technique, it kind of covers up any blending errors or not so smooth blending that you may have done. Now, I mentioned that I'm using Simon Says Stamp Pawsitively Saturated ink because of the beautiful colors they come in. But another ink that would work really great for this is Distress ink. I'm taping the Simon Says Stamp Modern Flower stencil onto the front of our inked panel. And I'm just creating a hinge like I did earlier. This is an older stencil, but I really like it because it creates a focal point at the center of the card. Now I'll cover up the inked panel with anything. I'm using my packaging here, and I'll spray an even layer of rubbing alcohol onto the stencil. I'll close that up and place it onto that flexible mat in my die cut machine and use the same sandwich I used earlier. After I ran that through, you'll notice that the stencil came unattached from the cardstock. That's okay, I can tape it back in place. And I'll repeat this process a few times. One of the things that I think is worth noting is this time you'll notice that the stencil is facing up towards the camera when I do this process, whereas last time the stencil was face down on that flexible embossing mat. I do recommend doing this technique so that the stencil is opposite of what I'm doing now, so that the stencil is face down on the embossing mat and the cardstock or the back of the cardstock is facing up towards you. I do feel that gives better results than what I'm doing here. But really you can play around with it, and it doesn't matter which way you do it. If you repeat this process a few times, you'll see that the rubbing alcohol will react more with the ink. I do find this technique works better with darker color inks. That's normal for a lot of different inking techniques where you want it to react. When there's a darker ink color, when you react with water or rubbing alcohol like I'm doing here, it softens the ink. So if you're starting with a darker color, you can see that softening a bit more. But as you can see here, it gives a beautiful result. I set that aside to dry, and the nice thing about rubbing alcohol is it dries very quickly, much quicker than water. But you could do this technique with water if you wanted to. Again, it just wouldn't give as crisp of results. I'm lining that same stencil up with that background. So I'm lining it up with the technique I just did and taping it onto my work surface. I have some Altenew titanium white paint here. I'm putting a little glob on my glass work surface. I'll add a little water to that and mix it up with a paintbrush. And then I will tap that over the stencil so that I'll have little white specks over the stenciled area. Now this won't make a big difference if you just do a little bit of these little specks. So I'm putting quite a bit down here. I'm putting a lot of these little white dots onto it. Now you could do less if you wanted to, but if you want the shape of these petals to show up with the stencil, you'll want to put more of these dots down. So you'll see I put quite a few down. And that leftover white paint, don't worry, I don't let it go to waste. You'll see me using it later on in this video. Okay, so after I'm done putting all those little white specks down, I can remove my stencil, clean it with rubbing alcohol, of course, and then we have a beautiful background that is great for a focal point sentiment at the center. Now the sentiment I chose to use is the Simon Says Stamp Just Because die set. This is an older one, but I think it's sweet because, again, it could be used for a lot of occasions. So here's our completed card, very simple. I trimmed that background down to be 4 by 5 1/4, and I put it onto a top folding white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. The Just Because I cut twice from white cardstock and glued together for stack dimension, and glued that right in the center. I thought about putting some accents or embellishments, but I really feel like the background has enough interest and it really draws you in to that sentiment. So this is another example of using rubbing alcohol with inks in your stencils. Okay, I have a third example for you. This one is again very simple, but it demonstrates how fun this technique is. I'm using another older stencil from Simon Says Stamp called Retro Arcs. I really like this one. And I'm again using Simon Says Stamp Pawsitively Saturated inks. This time I used Amethyst, Taffy, which needs to be re-inked, and Terracotta. I really like the look of purple faded to pink, faded to like a salmon color. If you're using distress inks, you could use Seedless Preserves, Picked Raspberry, and Coral Reef. Notice when I want to clean up my glass work surface, I use a spritz of rubbing alcohol and a dry cloth, and it cleans it up very quickly. All right, I have that Retro Arc stencil and I'm taping it onto the front of my inked background. I'm kind of lining up where I want the pattern to be, and then I'll use that same Easy C tape to create a hinge at the top. Now, I will say this technique should work with any stencil that you may have. I feel that rubbing alcohol would really work with this technique even if your stencil is detailed. If you used a detailed stencil and water for this technique, it would probably get a little mushy and not give as crisp of results. So try rubbing alcohol if you want to get that crisp look. So I'm doing the same technique I've done several times in this video. Again, here I have the stencil on the top when I run it through. I don't recommend that. I do recommend the stencil down first and the cardstock on top, but you'll see I give great results anyways. I do feel if the stencil is on the bottom, it doesn't take as many repetitions through the die cut machine, but you can experiment and see what works for you. As I do this a few times, I thought I'd talk more about rubbing alcohol. I'm using isopropyl alcohol in 90%, but there are different versions and they should all work just fine. Look at what you have in your bathroom. Chances are you already have some and you can put that to good use. I use rubbing alcohol, again, to clean my stencils, to clean my glass work surface, but I don't really use it for anything else. Actually, I do use it to clean my acrylic blocks, and tomorrow I'll talk a little more about that in my video. All right, so after doing this process a few times, I get this beautiful result. I think that is so much fun. It's a soft look. You could get this with water, but it wouldn't be as crisp. Just experiment and see what you come up with. Now to step this up a little bit, I used that leftover paint from before and I did a little speckle. Actually, I did some splatter, some spatter, everything. I did quite a bit on this because I'm not adding any accents. I'm just adding my sentiment on top. Now you could skip this. I know this look isn't for everyone. You could instead do some stamping with like maybe a text background stamp. It's totally up to you. Now remember that love you more sentiment I used earlier? This time I'm going to do love you alone. So I'm cutting the M off the L because they're connected with the die. And I'm cutting the Y from the M because those are also connected. This way I have the words love you separate and I can use those on my card. Ignore that card over to the left. That'll be in my video tomorrow. Now to get the Love You positioned just right onto the front of my card, I'm using my Simon Says Stamp 7x10 Tacky Mat. I'll talk more about this in a moment, but what I'm doing is placing these onto this Tacky Mat, which kind of holds them in place as I arrange all of these die cuts to say Love You. The die itself has Love You in the first row and then more below it. However, I want love on the top and you below it. So I'm just putting those onto this Tacky Mat to hold in place. You can see how I'm arranging them here. And then I will take a piece of temporary tape. I'm using Spellbinder's tape here. You could use washi tape or painter's tape. And I'm picking up all of those die cuts together and I'll peel them off of my Tacky Mat. I can flip that over, put liquid adhesive on the back of these, and then place them onto my background wherever I want them. This is one of the nice things about a tacky mat or grip mat. It allows you to range a position. You can put tape on top of it, pick up all your die cuts, and put them on your card wherever you want. And you can see I'm kind of playing around with the position here. When I'm happy with it, I'll press that tape down and put a magnet on top to make sure that really stays put on the front of our card. Now for the inside of the card, I'll be using a new Simon Says Stamp CZ Design I'm Sorry sentiments. The stamp set has a lot of beautiful sentiments that you can use either on the front or inside of your card. I encourage you to look at these. And then there are also 2 coordinating die sets that work well with it. I'll only be using the stamp set on the inside of my card today, and I'll actually use it tomorrow too. So here's the completed card. I trimmed the background down to be 3 3/4 by 5 inches, and I added it with some craft foam behind it onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card. I used some white small die cut hearts that I had in my stash to use as accents around the Love You. I feel like that's a great way to kind of make that Love You a little bit bigger and fill in more of the space, but still keep the card very simple. You could also use glitter cardstock for those if you prefer. Now, I mentioned earlier I would talk a bit more about the Tacky Mat from Simon Says Stamp. So this is the 7x10 Tacky Mat. They have different sizes. And what's unique about theirs is on one side it's perfectly smooth. And on the other side it has these kind of grid marks engraved into the Tacky Mat. So what I like to do is put the acetate that comes with it that has a black grid and line that up with the engraved lines on the Tacky Mat. And that way on one side it has that acetate with the black grid that helps you to line things up, and the other side has that grip to it that allows you to hold your stencils and cardstock and other things in place as you ink them. So you'll see me use this in future videos, but I thought this was a unique thing that the Simon Says Stamp Tacky Mat has to offer, and again it's available in various sizes. Okay, so there's a new fun technique using your inks and rubbing alcohol and stencils to create new looks. If you're interested in the supplies that I use, they are linked below in my YouTube description. I do encourage you to go to my blog. There's a lot more information there. And tomorrow, be sure to come back for another video that shows you a really cool variation of this technique and more cards. I thank you for spending this time with me. I hope to see you again soon, and thanks for watching.